Okay, I think I heard the bell ring, for better or worse. We are in chapter 18 of Matthew. Chapter 18 of Matthew. If you'll be turning there, we'll go ahead and get started here. Chapter 18 of Matthew. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see a happy and healthy group this morning. We're going to be in chapter 18 of Matthew, continuing on with the study. This is probably a challenge for me because of the fact that it's been a year and a half since I've taught, just due to the circumstances, so we will do our best. We had some questions on the overhead behind, which is where do we see the disciples really understanding the message that we've got coming in front of us during chapter 18? This is one of those chapters where, there are only a couple of verses. The red letter edition actually helps me a little bit to just look at it from an overview perspective. There's actually not a lot of engagement dialogue between the apostles, the disciples, and Jesus here. It's really all around Jesus communicating the message out. And I can go to the podium if you want, Ian. I'm happy to do either one. Okay, so as we look through this, we're going to take this chapter of Matthew in 3 sections, and we're going to start with let me go ahead and go. Actually, that's not. Oh yeah, sorry. This is the review. I forgot. So the review. Let's go ahead and look at the review as we get into chapter 18. We started off with the beginnings. Jesus is the King. Then we go on to the Sermon on the Mount. Remember how we have the two sides where we have the prelude, and then we actually have the teaching of Jesus. Then we get into the miracles, demonstrating authority, signals, healing purpose. And then we get the sending the 12, going on to something greater, the parables, the turning point, which is what we just got through studying. And now we're going to get into the parables here, the wandering sheep and unmerciful servant. I'm probably going to update that box as we go into it because I want to give it away. But those are the parables that we're looking at, but it's really all about some themes that we're going to be looking at today. So as we weave through this area, we're going to start with here, Matthew 18, 1 through 5, and we'll come back to those questions that were posed earlier on. So Matthew 18, 1 through 5, as we read this, let's think about this question. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child, is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me." So the question is, and I think I have a couple of mic runners here, why do the disciples raise this question now? What was going through their mind? Daniel? Here comes Jordan.
It's always a little hard or maybe impossible to know what is going through the disciples' minds, but I'm just thinking back to a couple events in chapter 17, one being the Transfiguration, where only 3 of them were selected to go and witness this, and Jesus had said not to tell anybody until after the resurrection. So, you can imagine Peter and John saying, "Well, we can't tell you what we saw, but it was really sweet." So maybe something like that, the Transfiguration could have provoked that. But then also, when they got back, the other disciples, the other 9, were failing to cast out a demon, and Jesus rebuked them and said, you should have been able to cast out this demon. So maybe, again, there was some insecurity that had developed or competitive spirit over those 2 events together.
Good. Thank you, Daniel. Anyone else? Brian?
Well, I'm also guessing that they had a worldly view of greatness, that they were seeking status in the kingdom and position. And I'm forgetting my passage. Was it the sons of Zebedee and their mother who let my son sit on your left and on your right? And the bottom line is, and I need to be able to cite this passage, but Jesus said the greatest in heaven is the servant of all, the humble servant, of which Jesus is described as a servant.
Thank you. So moving on to that, so yes, and I did have Transfiguration up there because I did talk to Daniel yesterday. So thank you, Daniel, for making me look good and then remembering. But really, I really think that is part of the discussion here, right? Were there special disciples? Were there some that were above the others? And there weren't, right? That's just not what Jesus is about, that he was out there to teach and preach. And then as Brian was mentioning with the concept of humility, right? Why even bring up the little children? Well, it's that concept of an ideal child, and this is coming out of the commentary, but I picked up on the word ideal because I've had children, and what you're going to hear isn't what you see all the time. They're innocent, they're simple, they're gentle, they follow their father and mother unquestioningly. They have no interest in wealth. They don't hate. They don't lie. They do hate. They do lie. They're obedient. They're believing. So the ideal child, that's the spirit of the child there. And I think that that's what we're looking at from a disciple's perspective here is why don't they take on that mantle of humility? Why are they even talking about who's the greatest? Well, John's better than everyone else. Jesus is always talking about Peter. Peter this, Peter that. Well, what about me, Judas, the other Judas? Why can't I ever get a mention? And then, anyway, so I think that that's part of what we're seeing here. The timing, I never know about why it came up at this point, but it did, and that's what we've got. So a couple of examples of humility from earlier in Matthew. Can anyone come up with a couple of them? I have two in mind, and they're not going to appear on the PowerPoint, so I won't give them away by accident. But they're actually both Gentiles, which is interesting to me. I can give you the chapter. Matthew 8. Matthew 8 will be our first one. Go ahead and turn there if you wish. Matthew 8, verse 8. It's the centurion, the story of the centurion. Everyone remembers what the story of the centurion? He comes to Jesus, and Jesus says, your faith is great. But he also says, you don't have to come to my house, Jesus. You say the word, and it'll be done. Not worthy for Jesus to come under my roof. Matthew 8, verse 8. And then the second one is really the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15, verse 27. And that story was where she was coming to Jesus looking for help. And basically, let me go ahead and turn to that. Matthew 15, verse 27. She says, yes, Lord, in verse 27, even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table. And that was in response to Jesus saying in verse 26, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. She said, yeah, but even little dogs eat from the table. And then verse 28, Jesus' response is, O woman, great is your faith, let it be as you desire. That was his answer to both the Canaanite woman as well as the centurion. And again, it was that spirit of humility that they approached him with, which in this instance, the disciples did not have. They were, or at least a portion of the disciples. Do we know if it's all of them? We don't know if it's all, but at least a portion. So, okay, so that is the first section. And then it ends up with Matthew 18, verse 5. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me, which harkens back to Matthew 5 and verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Okay, so I had allotted 10 minutes for that section, and it actually worked. I don't know how that worked. Okay, The next section we're going to look at here is about 15 minutes, and there's a lot in here. So let's go ahead and read Matthew 18, 6 through 20, and think about how these three stories are related as we read through this. Matthew 18, verse 6. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. If your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it up and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one that is straying? And if he should find it, assuredly I say to you, he rejoices more over that sheep than over the 99 that did not go astray. Even so, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear you, take with you 1 or 2 more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Assuredly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you that if 2 of you agree on earth concerning anything that they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Okay, so it seems on first glance that there are quite a few disconnected concepts here. It looks like you're down here, and then all of a sudden you jump over here to another item. But actually, I think we're going to be able to tie these together fairly well as we go through this passage. Now, I don't know if you're going to be disappointed or not, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on some of these really familiar concepts and passages in here. We're going to try to look at it more holistically. For example, we're not going to go into an in-depth study on bound in heaven, bound on earth discussion. Just not going to happen. So as we look through this, I'm looking at this as a theme of discussion between the physical world and the spiritual kingdom. So what are the overall themes seen here? The first one I'll give to you because we've already covered it, humility, right? It's that concept of the upside-down kingdom. Matthew 18, 1 through 4, right? Before we even get into this part of the section, it's all about you need to be humble. You need to be like little children. So before I go to the next theme, what is the theme that we see here in verses 6 through 9 in that story, or 10 through 14? Don't cause them to stumble is verses 6 through 9, and then if they wander, bring them back in 10 through 14. And I'm not clicking forward because it'll give you the answers, but you'll see them in a minute. Michael, we've got Jordan right behind you.
Seems like there's an emphasis on keeping each other from sin and keeping away from sin. I also, when I was studying this, I wrote down there's an emphasis on prioritizing the kingdom.
Okay, good.
But anyway, okay, good.
No, you're getting there. Anyone else? Brian? Here comes Jordan.
I think first we got to think about how are the many different ways that we can cause somebody else to stumble. I mean, we can be obtuse. We can, in our own sins, people can observe you as a Christian and see that sin causing disrepute to Christ and the church. It could be that you're involved in tempting another person to do that which they should not do. And then clearly I see here that Jesus is not speaking about just causing little children to stumble, but all of our, whoever we come into contact with. So we have a responsibility to preach the gospel, to live the example of Christ, and to bring others to Christ. And to cause somebody to sin or to stumble or to lose Christ is well, as Jesus said, woe to that person.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, Albert?
As we're going through this, at ground level, I see where it's an intense conversation with his immediate disciples. I mean, he called them. He saw something in them that was core for him to groom them for this task. This task is dire. This is going to be life-threatening, and I just kind of feel like it's an intimate conversation that we get to be a part of, that we can apply to ourselves today and what we should be doing. But if you think of, he's trying to get these disciples ready for the task before them and bring about it the seriousness of it and preparing for them. As I go through that, I just get a more involved sense of, I need to stress to you how important it is that a saved one not be lost. And and then he goes on to these other lessons. So I just feel like we're getting to be a part of a very intimate conversation.
No, exactly. And we're getting closer to what you'll see here in a second. As we think about verses 6 through 9, can you relate it easily back to the first verses 1 through 5? Can you see how the conversation around being great and who's going to have precedence and priority over everyone else could cause someone else to stumble? So I think those are really connected here. But it's also a transition passage as we click through. So I'm going to go ahead and put it up there. But as we click through this, the greatest in the kingdom turns into, don't let that cause someone else to stumble. But it's really all about compassion. And that's where he transitions into the next section there in verses 10 through 14, and the discussion around the concern about the little ones. The Son of Man has come to seek and save that which was lost. And then verse 12 through 14, the wandering sheep, the one in the 99. And as we think through that, I'll come back to verse 10 and 11 here in a second, but how should we react to someone leaving the faith or wandering away from the faith? How should we be reacted to that? Compassion. And we see that in James 5, 19 through 20, right? Let me go ahead and turn there really fast. Should have printed it off, but I didn't. James 5, 19 through 20. Brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, almost exactly the same wording here, and someone turns them back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. Again, exactly what verse 11 talks about when Jesus says, the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. So again, very much of a tie here from a compassion perspective. Now, let me go back to verse 10 for a second. We're not going to go into this in great detail either around, are there guardian angels? Their angels see the face of God. I think we talked about that, briefly in the Lord's Supper talk as well, that angels were there to testify. They're there to minister to God. And we talk about angels ministering to humans as well, but I don't really want to go there. What I want to point out is that souls are more precious than angels in heaven with God. And we see that in Hebrews 1, 4, and 5, where the Son of God, Christ, is better than angels. We also see that in verse 14 of Hebrews 1, where we talk about, let me pull that up really quick. Hebrews 1, 14. are they not all, they being angels, are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation? Again, so the angels are the servants. They're ministering to us. And I think that that's where Jesus is going with this idea in Matthew 18 here, basically just saying, look, take heed, verse 10, take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven, their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. The Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. So the angels are there, yes, but they don't have an exalted place because they're already in heaven. It's about that which God has come to seek and save. So that was verse 10 and 11. When we think about someone wandering away, again, it's that concept of compassion. It's loving them, looking for them, bringing them back. So, okay. Then in verse 15, we move on here. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him. So this is a progression, and we're going to see that here in a minute. But again, it's the same idea. Whenever I've read these verses before, it's all about, okay, how do I deal with conflict? How do I deal with someone that has done me wrong? It has nothing to do with that, well, a little bit. But it's really the message is, how do you turn them back to God? It's all about God. It's keeping God at the forefront. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide as well. But it's the compassion for the brother, not about your rights have been violated, not about, hey, I need to get this person right with me. So it's a progression. So what is the first step of that progression? You can just shout it out. We see it in verse 15. Talk to him in private. What's the second escalation? If that doesn't work, then take 2 or 3 with you to go talk to them. Is it to gang up on a person? No. It's to see the error of your ways, right? To come back to Christ. It's, hey, if you thought it was me, you wouldn't listen to me. I've got a couple other people, and they're thinking it's the same thing. They're seeing it the same way. Let's talk about the facts. Let's talk about what's going on. So it's a progression. If that doesn't work, then what? Go to the church. And again, is it to embarrass somebody? No. It's always that James 5:19 passage. It's to bring them back. It's the wandering sheep. So this is all connected here. And if that doesn't work, then what does Christ say? Verse 17. Give it up. Give it up. Let them be like a heathen and a tax collector. So, does that mean that Christ doesn't care about that person anymore? No. Does that mean that we shouldn't? No. But at what point do you keep putting your effort over here? You should always do it, right? There's always enough room. But at some point, you have to say, it's not going to happen right now, at least. And then let's wrap this up with verses 18 through 20. Alignment with God's will is what I called out here. Assuredly, I say to you, whatever is bound on heaven will be bound on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. There's a really good deep study here where it talks about present tense, future tense. Again, because of the nature of our study here, we're not getting into that. Daniel will probably give us a lesson on that one day, or Steve. So no pressure. But to me, the theme is it's compassion. We have to be aligned with God's will. God's will is to, anybody? Verse 11? That's the theme of the book, the theme of the chapter at least. Save the lost. Save the lost. What can we do to save the lost? It's always about them from Jesus' perspective. It's not about us from our perspective. So in order to have that perspective, what do I have to do? I have to know God's will. I have to know what he wants me to do. I have to know what he wants me to teach. And I can do that through classes like this even. But then as long as I am the spokesperson for God through his word, then I'm aligned with him. Therefore, this whole concept of binding on earth, binding in heaven, It's actually kind of it's an outcome. It's not, there's nothing we have to do to it because we've already been aligned, we're already there. So those were my thoughts on that. The next point was, what are these 3 key points in Jesus from 10 through 14? And I'll just click through them because I'm actually not sure about time. Little ones have friends in high places, and this is where I am pulling from the commentary. So these are not my own thoughts, but I like them. Little ones, and the concept of little ones, and I think, Brian, you may have mentioned it, is it Christians? Is it any person, seek and save mankind? I don't know. We could probably have that discussion, but I'll use the word little ones. So friends in high places, who do we Christians have in heaven right now advocating on our behalf? Christ. We've got that. He is in heaven. So I've got friends in high places. I know that's a song too, by the way. Little ones are so important that the Son of Man came to save them. And we see that back in Matthew 1, verse 21 as well. Here, we've got it in verse 11. We've already pointed that out a couple of times. So we've got an advocate in heaven. We had the Son of Man, Son of God, come down to earth to save us. And then finally, the will of the Father is that none would perish. And again, we see that in verse 14. But we also pick up on that same exact concept in Matthew 7, verse 21. So I thought that was a nice segue here as we go into the final parable. And there are going to be a couple things that we're going to read in the final parable that will have to come back and relate to this section as well as we go through that. So Matthew 18, 21 through 35, as we hope to wrap up here. And let's think about this question. Is this story only about forgiveness, right? Because this is the parable of the unforgiving servant or ungrateful servant. So that's the title that has been assigned to it in my Bible. So let's read together. Matthew 18, verse 21. Then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. And that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me what you owe me. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet, and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him. So my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. So it's always so easy to teach a passage where Jesus actually tells us the answer. What am I supposed to make of this? Well, verse 35, right? This is about us and God. So, all right, let's get into this. So, well, first of all, any reaction? Is there anything more about this story than forgiveness? Because we use that a lot, right? We talk about, well, you should forgive others. And that is a theme in the Bible. We see that clearly. Michael?
there we go. It makes me think about, I guess, well, my debt. I mean, my own forgiveness in relationship to, when you see other people and you respond to other people, the way you treat them, if you see them sin, do you lift yourself up like I'm self-righteous? That you're wrong. I'm right. And like how do you treat them? Are you gonna? I don't know. That's kind of what I see as kind of I remember the Romans verse, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, right? And so I think that's what it's really hitting at here is, obviously we're to stand against sin. We hate sin, but remember that we're sinners, and and that's part of always needs to be in your mind when you're forgiving others is I don't know. So I guess that ties into the humility, huh?
I was just going to say, you used the term progression of chapter 18 a second ago. I think, to me, this kind of finishes up the whole linear progression of this is who's the greatest, what is my position, then it kind of transitions more into, hey, what does God feel about me, how do I feel about other people, and then to this point here, maybe to your point too, Michael, that it's about, hey, how do we view ourselves in this parable, not just us forgiving other people, which to your point, we absolutely should, but where do we fit in this broader picture of forgiveness?
Perfect. Let me take us into Peter's. Oh, sorry, Brian, did you have one?
I was simply going to say, is I see a larger meaning here in that it goes to the meaning and purpose of this life. Jesus said he was faithful with little, i.e. all that he's given to us in this life, doesn't compare to what will be given to us the next. So he who is faithful with little will be faithful with much. So then you have this evil servant who was not faithful with what he was given to, but abused. And if that person were to enter into heaven, he would abuse even greater power and authority. And I think you'll see that the children of God do receive power and glory and authority in the heavenly places. So he proved himself unworthy to enter into heaven by being unfaithful with that which God had actually given to him. And that's how I view this in a larger context.
And we'll talk about that a little bit more here. So as we look through here, what is Peter's question? And let's think about it. Does anyone, and I won't ask for the verse, but remember the verse? Hey, if someone sins against you, turn the other cheek. Okay, that's one, right? So if you have one issue, then give them a second chance. Okay, the Pharisees, apparently, according to the commentary, that the typical was, hey, 3 times. You got 3 strikes, you're out. We hear that even today, and not just in baseball. But from that perspective, hey, we'll give you 3 times. And if you still are sinning against me, then, well, I gave you 3 times, and it was more than turn the other cheek. So again, this idea of progression. So Peter went even farther than that. Hey, 7 times, that's double the 3 plus 1. Then the question would be, well, that's really, really generous. And Jesus says, no, 490. No, he didn't say 490, but I always do the math. So he says, no, not just 7 times, but 70 times 7, which is just a really large number right here. So as you think through that, the question comes to my mind, do we even know what this means? As we think through, is there a way to forgive that same person after they commit the same sin against you? Well, they came back and said they were sorry. Well, did they not mean it the first time, or the second, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, or the sixth, or the seventh? And I'm not going to count all the way to 490. But if they're coming back and they're actually humbling themselves, then can we relate to that? Yeah, we have sin. Okay. It's not even, I think Jordan just said this, it's not even about us. It's not even about our interactions with each other. It's about our interaction with God and his interaction with us. How do you think he feels about us when we've committed that sin the 490th time? Because we're tempted by it. We're enslaved by that. And it's not all sin, but everyone has things that get them. How does that even relate? But that's exactly how God looks at us. But we're not even able, I'm not even able, I don't know about we, I'm not able to do this. At some point, I'm like, well, you didn't mean it. And you didn't mean it when you said, please forgive me. And yet, you have to. You have to at some point. They come, they're repentant, and they say, I'm sorry. So as we think through that, think about it in the context of back then. Hey, if you were racking up a debt, you go to prison if you can't pay it. Oh, not just you. Now your decisions and your decisions for your family impact your family because they go into servitude, into slavery to pay off that debt that you incurred. I can't even imagine. Okay, so that was Peter. And then the question, how would you prevent the abuse of that power if you had it? As we jump into this part, what are the examples of forgiveness seen in this parable? And again, it starts with who in this parable in verse 23. The king, the master. So various translations, I think my translation said that the debt was 10,000 talents. Again, we can look, 10,000 bags of gold, 10,000 gold coins. It's relative, but it's a lot. Is that a lot or a little? That's a lot. The debt was great. Prison and servitude for his family was due. The servant cried out for mercy. What was the master's response? He got mercy. Mercy was given. The debt was canceled. What should the servant's response have been? It's not even recorded for us, which is really interesting, which tells me it's not about the servant. The original pay it forward, right? That debt was so great, that servant should have said, I now have freedom for my family. But there was a problem. What's the next progression? So now you have the master to the servant, then you've got the servant to his fellow servants, friends. It says fellow servants. 100 silver coins, 100 denarii. Again, the relative value of the two, a factor of 100. The value of gold versus silver. So huge difference. What did the servant resort to? He went hold and choked his fellow servant over 100 silver coins. What did his fellow servant do? The same thing he did. Cried out for mercy. But it was a no-go. The servant said no. Put him in jail. I need my 100 silver coins. And finally, the fellow servants were outraged and told the master, and we're going to see what the master's result was here in a minute. I do have 5 minutes. Comments? Daniel has a comment. And Jordan is running, literally running across the auditorium.
Your point is clearly Jesus' point about the relative, the comparison between what the man owed to the king and then what his fellow servant owed to him. So maybe we're not supposed to make a whole lot of the specific numbers, but the first one, obviously, that's an amount that you could probably never even pay in a lifetime. I mean, 110,000 bags of gold, that was unrealistic. You'd never pay it back, and it was forgiven. It's interesting to me that the second amount is not nothing. I mean, if a denarii is a day's wage, 100, that's a third of a year's salary. That's a significant, that hurts to be out that much money. But what Jesus is saying is, again, relative to what he was forgiven, it literally is nothing. Or it's very close, as you say. So, when people sin against us, it hurts. It's not There's a significant pain, a significant loss. But what Jesus is the discipline Jesus is teaching us here is to always have as the backdrop what I have done to God and the debt that I could never pay. And that is what's going to, instruct me as I think about how to interact with someone who is sinning as me.
Thank you, Daniel. And I think this ties right back to the second section that we looked at. It's the spiritual versus the earthly. It doesn't matter what happens on this earth, although the Psalm 90 was a great passage to talk about that too, right? But what you do here adds up to what God has already promised to give us in heaven if we're following his will. So as we think about this, it's back to our themes of compassion. It's about the soul that was not saved or that needs to be saved. And then I just wanted to finish up here. What are the consequences of not forgiving? And again, let's go ahead and firmly put on our spiritual hat here, right? How did the master respond? And again, this is the second time that we're going to see this. And I already highlighted it in verse 35. He called the wicked servant to him. Judgment day. He called out the lack of mercy by the servant. I don't know. I won't make a... He became angry because the servant knew, and he knew, the master knew, what that great debt of sin, what that great debt of money was given. Jordan, we got one more comment from Michael as is coming over. And then he handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he would pay it back.
This section we're on right here reminds me of his teaching with the measure you give is the measure you'll receive. When he's talking about, I guess the log in the eye and the speck and all that, but it seems to be clearly illustrated. The servant didn't give mercy, so he's going to get what he was dealing out. Anyway.
Thank you. No, that's good. And so then the question would be, how does this parable answer Peter's question? How often should I forgive? So it's really not that question. Well, the question's answered, but it's really the question of how often does the Father forgive us, right? And the answer is, I don't want it to be 490 times. That's my own answer, because I make mistakes and I'm tempted and I do things I shouldn't. But the consequences are outlined, and this is the second time we see this, verse 35. So my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. And it was, verse 34, his master was angry, delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him. Now the key here is we'll never be able to pay that back. And Jesus has paid that for us. Now, if we don't take advantage of that, that's when we come into this consequence. So I'm sure the bell will ring here, but I'll at least put the final questions on the board. I didn't think that I would get to them, and I was right. But the themes that I think that we were able to see today were it's compassion, it's humility, and forgiveness. And it's interesting how the parables were different, but they were all kind of connected together, especially the last two, as they kind of came together with the unforgiving servant and the one before it. So if you're compassionate for someone or their circumstance, are you more likely to help them? Seems logical to me that yes. If I can walk in someone's shoes, understand what they're going through, get to know them well enough to understand what they're doing, why they're doing, how they're in that situation, then I can find ways to help them. If I have all of that information, then I should be more compassionate toward them, and then forgiveness, therefore, should come a little bit easier. But it's also the same with us and God. So he had the right by law to condemn us, but instead we have salvation through his Son. So that, to me, it ends with verse 35. Here are the consequences, but the real answer is back to verse 11, for the Son of Man has come to save that which is lost. So awesome. We made it to the end on time. Chapter 19 is what we'll look at on Wednesday. You have Daniel back. Thank you.